And Dean Baker, I wanted to ask you about another issue too, which I think the public doesn't sufficiently understand, which is the whole issue of China and the devaluation of its currency, which has been happening in the last few days. What that's all about, and how we should really be thinking about it. What are your thoughts on China's most
Okay, well,
recent
first, just
devaluation?
to sort of get the headline issue, China's lowered the value of its currency against the dollar. It's by about 4% now in the last, let's say, week, so I don't know the exact days here. But in any case, they did this as conscious, explicit policy. I just mentioned that because we often get into these, to my view, very silly arguments about does China manipulate that term? I hate using that term, but does China manipulate its currency as though this is something they do in the middle of the night when no one's looking? And there's not really an issue here. They open their central bank openly targets the value of its currency against the dollar, and they said they're lowering that value by about 4%. And the reason why that matters to us is that it makes Chinese goods much more competitive relative to U.S. goods in the international economy. So the effect is we're likely to sell fewer goods to China and to third countries because China's goods will be relatively cheaper. We're going to import more from China because now their goods are relatively cheaper for people in the United States. So that hurts our manufacturing industry. We're likely to see a somewhat larger trade deficit, and that will mean some loss of jobs. Now, the debate or discussion in the media, I think, has really missed a lot of the story here because you've seen a lot of the articles and columnists talking about it, saying that this is actually a market outcome, that what's going on here is that China's responding to the fact that its currency is now overvalued, and they're reducing the value and responding to the market. The problem, the part that leaves out, is China's central bank holds close to $4 trillion in reserves, primarily dollars, but also euros, some Japanese yen, some other currencies, but primarily dollars. And that keeps up the value of the dollar against its currency. And they're still holding that. So to say that somehow China, that we're looking at a market outcome, that ignores this massive amount of currency that China's central bank continues to hold, that if, we're simply talking about pure market outcomes, they wouldn't be holding that.
Well, I may be off base about this, but it seems to me that by calling it a market outcome, not only is it an inaccurate description of the facts or the reality, but it also creates a kind of, whether intentionally or not, I'm not suggesting it's intentional, a kind of ideological smokescreen that prevents us from saying, well, we may want to be establishing a trade policy and a currency policy as well. That it seems to me suggesting this is some sort of magical natural event that we shouldn't interfere with when we may want to set a policy of our own.
That's right. So it treats it that this is just something that happened and you should accept that. And many of the articles, or certainly the columns, have been in that vein. And it's important to point out this often gets into an issue of China bashing. And, it's not a question of whether we like or dislike the Chinese government. The point here is that there's a lot of interest involved, and many of them are actually U.S. corporate interests. So when China lowers the value of its currency, as it just did, on the one hand, our workers, our manufacturing workers are unhappy. They're going to lose jobs. They're going to see cuts in pay because of this. On the other hand, we have a lot of companies. General Electric produces a lot of their goods in China. They're not unhappy.
So does Apple, right? So Apple presumably is happy about this too.
Yeah. So this isn't a story of China versus the U.S. This is a story of some industries in China. It's a mixed story in China. Some industries in China benefiting, some industries in the U.S. benefiting, and a lot of manufacturing workers in the U.S. hurting.
So I guess the takeaway there is, rather than mythologize what's going on, either with sinister overtones or naturalistic overtones, that we should be thinking about what the best considered strategy for our own country and our own workforce is, right?
Exactly. And, again, talking about the Chinese currency, I've heard people say, oh, China will never agree to, if we're to, we asked President Obama, or Secretary Lewis, Treasury Secretary, to, ask them to raise the value of their currency, they would never agree to that. Well, that's silly. Of course they would agree to it, given the right trade-offs. We aren't talking about little kids. We're talking about, adults that make deals, that make concessions. that, sometimes do things they don't want to do in exchange for other things that they want. So, I think it makes sense for us to say, what would a currency policy look like that we want? And then say, okay, how do you get China to go along with that? And that means concessions. I mean, China's not a little country. We can't just go in there and say, hey, we want you to do X, Y, and Z. We'd say, we want you to do X. We want you to see a higher value for your currency. And, you have things you want from us. Let's talk.
Right. Well, I hope we get to that point. And as always, Dean Baker, thanks for coming on the show and clearing these issues up for us.
Thanks a lot for having me on.